In 1946, when archaeologists were excavating the Qumran caves and unearthing the Dead Sea Scrolls, they stumbled upon something extraordinary. These archaeologists uncovered a text dating to the 1st century BCE, which would be referred to as 1 QP Hab. The 1 indicates it was discovered inside of Cave 1. Q stands for Qumran, the place of the excavations, and P-Hab indicates this was a pesher on Habakkuk. A pesher, for those of you who don't know, is an interpretation of Scripture, a commentary written by followers of a faith to expound upon the meaning of a text. This pesher on Habakkuk covered the first 2 chapters of the book and examined every phrase of those chapters, providing a line-by-line commentary of this ancient Scripture. What makes this truly an amazing discovery is that it remains one of the oldest comprehensive commentaries on any book from the Hebrew Bible ever discovered. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. In Part 4 of our coverage of the 12 minor prophets, we'll cover 4 of the remaining 5 books: Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, and Malachi. Like some prophets we've encountered already, Habakkuk is known to us only through the book which bears his name. Like many collections of oracles, the oracles are delivered as a series of poems which portray a dialogue between Yahweh and the prophet. Dating the book is difficult, but it does concern the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, when the Chaldeans besieged the city. So obviously the oracles were written sometime after those events. The book can be divided into 6 sections. They are Habakkuk's first complaint, Yahweh's response, Habakkuk's second complaint, Yahweh's second response, sayings against tyrants, and the hymn about Yahweh's reign. Habakkuk raises his concern for an ancient theological problem, the existence of evil in the world. He asks his deity how long he must cry for help and point out the violence in the world, only for Yahweh to simply ignore the evil and iniquity. Because of this, the law and covenant established by Yahweh is seen to be meaningless. It was meant to establish order and justice, but without enforcement from Yahweh, it carries no weight and has become perverted. As is typical in the Hebrew Bible, whenever Yahweh is challenged, he responds with demonstrations of power and violence, rather than removing the evil which has caused the distress to the innocent. He instructs the prophet to behold the great deeds he is now accomplishing, the sending of the Chaldeans, which he has raised up as an instrument of destruction against the city of Carchemish. An interesting point of note here is that the actions of the Chaldeans who are acting on Yahweh's behalf commit the very crimes which are typically levied against the residents of Jerusalem prior to the Babylonian conquest. They seize houses that don't belong to them, prey upon the weak, commit violence, and exalt themselves. These are the crimes of the temple priests and the city princes, but they're now being levied against Yahweh's own soldiers of devastation. The Chaldeans move like a storm wind and gather up captives like sand. Habakkuk responds to Yahweh's actions by calling out the Lord's hypocrisy. Rather than correct the problem of evil in the world, removing the wicked from power, Yahweh has chosen to use them as his instruments against the people of Judah. He points out that the purity of Yahweh should prevent him from looking at evil, yet he uses them for his own ends while ignoring the plight of the just. Yahweh has turned the people into leaderless creatures, like fish in the sea being hauled up with hooks and nets. So Habakkuk will stand upon the ramparts and await Yahweh's answer to his complaints, which he hopes will be something more than the silence that his complaints have prompted in the past. An interesting point comes in the first few verses of Habakkuk's second complaint, in verse 12. He says, "Are you not from of old, O Yahweh, my holy God? You shall not die." Early commentaries and later copies of Habakkuk reveal various changes made to this passage to remove the suggestion that Yahweh might die, and thus they scrub away the blasphemous notion from the oracle. We've seen in previous episodes that Yahweh was likely a dying and rising God, and subtle references to this idea have escaped notice of biblical redactors. This appears to be another such example. Another point of note is that the complaint about the Chaldeans catching people in nets appears in some texts as people being struck with swords, the difference in the Hebrew being only a single consonant, so either reading could be correct. Yahweh responds to Habakkuk's criticism in chapter 2. He commands the prophet to write down his visions on tablets so that one who reads it may run. This likely means that the text should be written so large and plainly that the tablet could be read by a man running past. The vision Habakkuk is to write down is one of the coming time when his prophecy would be fulfilled. The wicked and the just will be separated at this appointed time. The subject of the book then switches gears in chapter 2, verse 5, with sayings against the tyrants. This is a collection of woes against the Chaldeans, which begin in verses 6, 9, 12, 15, and 19. Each of the 5 woes is imagined to be spoken by the nations or the people who have been victimized by the invaders. The first woe concerns itself with the Chaldeans stealing what does not belong to them. It looks to a time when their victims will rise up against them and seek their vengeance, looting the nation as they themselves were once looted. The second woe, which begins in verse 9, targets Nebuchadnezzar's attempt to establish his own dynasty, as he does evil in an attempt to build up his own house. He elevates himself to rise up above misfortune, and captures many people, thus forfeiting his own life. His plots will not result in success and a lasting dynasty, but will instead invite calamity as justice for his own wrongdoings, and his own house will stand as witness against him. The third woe, in verses 12 to 14, speaks against those builders in Babylon who have made a city through bloodshed and established a town through injustice. Again, this may not refer to actual construction of physical buildings, but to the creation of a dynasty. Rather than improve Babylon, the king set about conquering other nations and enslaving their people. These nations grow weary of toiling for the invaders, so Yahweh will punish the wicked and all will know his glory. This knowledge of his might will cover the land just as the waters covered the sea, treating us to another example of Yahweh's wrath being linked with his prideful boasting of power. The fourth woe uses drunkenness as a metaphor for wrath. The intoxicating beverage is the cup of wrath, a symbol of Yahweh's destruction that has appeared elsewhere in the prophetic books. The oppressors have given wrath to their neighbors, meaning they have abused them in some fashion. This is done until their nakedness is seen. We're reminded of the Noah story in Genesis 9 when the survivor becomes drunk and is discovered naked by his sons, though here it means that the neighboring nations have been stripped of their wealth, and their people by the invading army. So Yahweh's own cup of wrath will come around to the Chaldeans, and they'll suffer the same fate as their victims, being stripped bare and shamed before all the nations for the violence that they've committed against their neighbors. One point of note before moving on from the fourth woe is in verse 16, as Yahweh says they will be shamed and stagger. The word used for stagger is almost identical to the Hebrew word for be uncircumcised, the difference being the order of 2 letters, and some copies of the book contain this variation in the text. So it could read that Yahweh will shame them with their drunkenness by making them stagger, or that he will expose their uncircumcised members for all to see. Both meanings work in the context of the surrounding sentences. The fifth woe, which begins in verse 18 and concludes chapter 2, concerns itself with idolatry. Yahweh questions the usefulness of carved images. Humans make gods of wood and stone, and then cover them in silver and gold, and shout, "Arise," to them, hoping that they will wake. This is contrasted with the living God of Yahweh, who is likewise called to arise in other Old Testament books, including the Psalms. Yahweh, according to the closing lines of the chapter, is actually a living God who dwells in his holy temple. Something of note here is that all of these woes begin with an exclamation, except for this final woe. That doesn't come up until verse 19. This may indicate that the verses are out of order. If you move verse 19 with its exclamatory beginning to the beginning of the woe and change the order to 19, 18, 20, then the woe makes more sense, revealing that this may have been the original order. Finally, we come to chapter 3 of Habakkuk, which is likely a later addition. Scholars believe this for a variety of reasons. First, when the residents of Qumran were writing their commentary mentioned in the introduction of this episode, they knew nothing of this third chapter. Their coverage ends with the 5 woes in chapter 2. Another reason is the style of writing. While the first 2 chapters are oracles concerning Yahweh's governance of the world, chapter 3 is a hymn that's meant to be set to music, as is mentioned in the opening verses, and it contains references to the types of instruments which should be played while singing this song. Finally, this chapter doesn't appear in any of the oldest Hebrew copies of the book. It won't appear until the Septuagint copies from the 3rd century BCE. This chapter may have been part of the original book and was excised by the Qumran community, or it may have been appended later. We simply don't know and lack sufficient evidence to determine the answer. The chapter begins by stating that what follows is a prayer according to Shigionot. The exact meaning of this term is unclear, but it's believed to be a musical term, meaning the manner in which the prayer should be sung, like saying, according to Jingle Bells, meaning that you should sing this chapter to the tune of Jingle Bells. Though I tried that and it doesn't work, so obviously that isn't the correct tune. The song begins by stating that the prophet has heard of the greatness of Yahweh and stands in awe of his work. He looks forward to the time when he will make himself known and remember his compassion for his people. Yahweh came from Mount Paran in the region of Teman, which is in the nation of Edom. We saw this in the Exodus story and several times since, as Yahweh is often referred to as an Edomite god, which matches the archaeological record. Worship of him seems to have originated with tribes in that part of the world and spread north into Israel, where he then merged with the Canaanite god Baal around the time of the late Bronze Age collapse. We're then told that the glory of Yahweh spread across the heavens like the light of the sun, giving us another example of Yahweh being portrayed as a solar deity. He also shows his strength by raising up his horns. Often we've seen mention of Yahweh's strength in relation to a great horned beast called the Reem, which sometimes gets mistranslated as a unicorn, such as in the King James Bible. This is another reference to that concept, as bulls were signs of strength in ancient times. He's accompanied by pestilence and plague, one walking before him and the other following in his footsteps. The words used here don't just mean that Yahweh brings calamity wherever he goes, they're references to divine beings, a god named Pestilence and another named Plague. These are among Yahweh's divine entourage, his devastating soldiers that were sent out to spread death and destruction, as we will see later in the book of Revelation. When the great seals are broken, it's ancient gods that are unleashed upon the world. As he walks, the mountains are shattered and the orbits of the stars are disrupted. This too is imagery that we've seen before. Check out episodes 48 and 52 for more information on the importance of constellation in Hebrew mythology. Yahweh rages against the rivers and the sea, attacking with bow, arrow, and chariot. This is the divine combat against the primordial chaos monsters that lies behind the story of Genesis chapter 1 and the closing chapters of Job. Yahweh fights against the sea dragons in order to establish order and to elevate himself within the pantheon at the beginning of time. His flashing spears shine light as he throws them, a clear reference to his link with storm gods such as Baal. He flings lightning bolts and causes the clouds to drop rain upon his enemies. The sun and moon are cast down, showing his dominance over other gods of the pantheon who are symbolized by these celestial objects, and his wrath is visited upon the earth. He comes to bring destruction, but also to save his chosen people who are led by his Messiah. This is a reference to his divine king who rules in his place. The ancient enemy is pierced with his arrows, just as we saw in Job when he fought Leviathan, and he wields storms as weapons in verse 14. The Tehom, another word for Tiamat the dragon, and also for the deep ocean, is trampled by his horses. The singer of this song trembles at the sight of such awesome power, and his legs buckle beneath him. Great disaster will be visited upon any who attack him. Even though his trees do not bear fruit and the flocks have all vanished, he will still remain loyal to Yahweh, who will save him, and allow him to walk among the highest mountain peaks, stepping from one sacred hilltop shrine, just as Yahweh steps when he visits the earth. The chapter ends with a musical instruction indicating that the song should be played on stringed instruments. The point of the song is that Yahweh is the creator of the world, the God who fought and defeated the chaos dragons at the beginning of time, and will save the people whenever they face defeat. He will intervene on their behalf, and through his anointed leader will deliver them from calamity. So they should have faith in that promising future, even when all seems lost. According to the opening lines of Zephaniah, the prophet lived during the reign of Josiah, the great reformer, from 2 Kings 22 to 23, from 640 to 609 BCE. The book references the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE, so we know that it was written sometime after that. He is said to be the son of a Cushite, someone from Sudan or Ethiopia, which seems extremely odd considering the other three names of his ancestors given in his genealogy all have Yahwistic names. One of these names, the fourth ancestor listed, is Hezekiah. This could be a reference to King Hezekiah, but the text doesn't draw any attention to the fact that the prophet is of royal descent, so it's likely his great-great-grandfather just bore the same name as a king of Judah. Another point of note concerning this ancestor is that some ancient manuscripts list his name as Hilkiah instead of Hezekiah, which could be accidental as the difference in Hebrew is only a single letter, or it could be a deliberate change. His ancestor might have been Hilkiah, but the name was deliberately changed to Hezekiah in order to link him with another righteous king from Judah's history. All of these are possibilities, but we have no evidence to shift our understanding in any direction. The 3 chapters of Zephaniah can be divided into 4 sections: the judgment of Judah, the judgment of the other nations, Jerusalem's reproach, and the nations punished while Jerusalem is restored. As is typical of the prophetic books, Zephaniah begins with the familiar topic of the day of the Lord, a devastating judgment that sweeps away Judah and sends the population into exile. The oracle informs us that Yahweh will visit his wrath upon human and beast alike, birds and fish, leaving no living thing safe from his anger, which was kindled by the worship of pagan gods and idolatry, as we learn in verse 4 of the opening chapter. Another accusation levied against the people is worship of other gods of heaven, those subservient to Yahweh. Remember that the name Yahweh Sabaoth means Lord of the heavenly host, so this isn't just an accusation of worshiping foreign gods, but of worshiping other gods of the Hebrew pantheon. Yahweh is to be worshipped to the exclusion of all other deities. This is known as monolatry. Yahweh also speaks out against swearing oaths in the name of Milcom, an Ammonite god, so that even this practice by those who worship Yahweh is unacceptable. Their oaths should be sworn in Yahweh's name alone. The population of Judah will be served up as a great sacrifice, punishing officials, kings, and princes. Anyone who is influenced by foreign customs will feel his wrath. A curious phrase in verse 9 draws our attention. Yahweh states that he will punish those who leap over the threshold. This practice was to prevent contact with demons believed to lurk in the doorways at a home's entrance. As superstition stated, if one simply stepped through the doorway or lingered there too long, they could become touched by these demons and suffer a curse or an early death. It's possible that the practice of sacrificing an animal or a child before a major construction project was meant to eradicate or to satiate this particular demon. Yahweh will then search through the city with a lamp, seeking out those in need of punishment. Their wealth will be given away, and the fruit of their vineyards will not be theirs to enjoy. Warriors shriek in agony and distress as Yahweh arrives in a cloud of darkness, which blackens the day, and the thunder of heavy trumpets. Silver and gold won't save the people as their blood and entrails are poured out, and the population is driven away like chaff before a storm wind. Only those who seek Yahweh's protection in humility might be spared from his burning anger. The second section of Zephaniah, Yahweh's judgment against the nations, begins in chapter 2, verse 4, and finishes out the chapter at verse 15. The section begins with the pronouncement that Gaza, Ashkelon, Akron, and Ashdod will all be destroyed. The word of Yahweh is against them. The Canaanites and Philistines will all perish, and their lands will be left empty, their fields becoming desolate pastures for grazing animals. The passages present us with imagery of their destruction, but lacking is any mention of their crimes which have incited such anger from Yahweh. The omission of details typical in this style of oracle is indicative of a damaged text. It appears that fragments of the oracles in the judgment against the nations have been lost at some early date. In verse 8, we find the oracle against Moab and the Ammonites. These people are, according to the legend of Genesis, the descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew, who was rescued from Sodom immediately prior to its destruction. Unlike the previous portion of the oracle, a crime is mentioned here, that of insulting and taunting the Israelites. Because of this, their cities will become like Sodom and Gomorrah, a wasteland and a salt pit, giving us another reference to the story from Genesis. The remnant of the people of Judah will plunder them as Yahweh terrorizes their inhabitants. The section ends with a third and final oracle directed against the Cushites and the Assyrians. The Cushites, we are told, will be slain by the sword of Yahweh. That's it. That's all that remains of this section of the oracle. We aren't told what they did to deserve such punishment or how it will occur, only that it will occur. This is likely part of a separate oracle, given the Cushites are a separate people living quite distant from the lands of the others in this chapter, meaning the third oracle of this chapter is actually a composite of two distinct oracles. The oracle against the Assyrians states that Nineveh will be made into a waste, dry as a desert. Animals will hide in caves and owls will nest in the branches of her trees. Something of note here in chapter 2, verse 14, is that the text is nearly identical to Isaiah 34:11. But that's not the interesting part. When the passage speaks of a screeching desert owl nesting in the trees, it might be a mistranslation. This is one of the passages thought to be a reference to the Lilith, a type of wilderness demon that haunted wild places and assaulted people in their sleep, seducing men and stealing the breath from sleeping infants. This means that the land will become suitable only for deadly demons and wild animals. The exultant city of Nineveh, once mighty and secure, will be torn down and become an example to all those who pass by. Our third section of Zephaniah, Jerusalem Reproached, covers the first 7 verses of chapter 3. The oracle opens by calling Jerusalem rebellious and polluted, and accusing it of accepting no correction and listening to no guiding voice. It doesn't trust in Yahweh. The officials within the city are like lions and wolves. Its prophets are treacherous people. The priests profane the holy and violate the law. But at dawn Yahweh will render judgment upon the wicked, once again linking judgment and Yahweh's arrival with the rising of the sun. He cuts down nations and makes their streets deserted. The people will learn to fear Yahweh because of the violence he will do to them. The book concludes by contrasting the punishment against other nations with the restoration of Jerusalem. The oracle begins with Yahweh instructing the people to wait for him until the day he arises as an accuser. He will assemble the nations and pour out his wrath upon them like a fiery anger which will consume all of the earth. We see here the themes and imagery which are foundational to the beliefs behind future books like Revelation and Enoch. While the other nations are being torn apart, Yahweh's people will be made pure so they may call upon his holy name. He will gather them from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia and from Assyria to the north, and they shall bring offerings to their Lord. And no longer will people exalt themselves like braggarts. Those overly proud rulers will be removed from their midst. Instead, they shall be humble and seek refuge in Yahweh's company. Jerusalem is repeatedly referred to in the feminine, called Daughter Zion, a reference to the ancient goddess associated with the city. Alongside this, we also get a reference to the divine king, as Yahweh is referenced to as the King of Israel. He's said to be a mighty Savior who is within their midst. This, too, has been seen in the prophetic material, as their war god is depicted as the national savior. The people of Jerusalem are called to rejoice in verse 14, as Yahweh removes his judgment from against them. Again, Yahweh is called a mighty Savior within their midst, and he will renew the population, giving us an indicator of the timeline for this writing, as we have here in verse 17 a reference to the return and restoration of the exiles after the fall of Babylon. So complete will be the restoration, according to verse 18, that no one will even remember their disgrace. Perhaps if Yahweh wanted this, he wouldn't have had the entire ordeal recorded in the most widely distributed book in history. The Israelites are equated with the lame and the outcast and will be given praise while their oppressors are cast down. We now come to the book of Haggai, which concerns itself with Judah during the beginning of the post-exilic period under King Darius of Persia at the end of the 6th century BCE. The general message of the book is that the prosperity and safety of the community in Judah is linked with the construction of the New Jerusalem temple. The 2 chapters of Haggai are the temple restoration and oracles of encouragement. Haggai has multiple mentions of dates which give us a time frame for the setting. According to the text, the prophecies were written between August 29th and December 18th in the year 520 BCE. This places it in the same time frame as the first 8 chapters of Zephaniah, which claims to be written between October 520 BCE and December 518 BCE. Of course, this doesn't mean that the book was written during this time period, only that this is the setting for the book. Another point of interest before we get started is the problem of opposition from Judah's adversaries, or complete lack thereof. A prominent feature of this time period, according to the book of Ezra, was the significant opposition to the rebuilding of not only the temple, but of the city of Jerusalem. But Haggai knows of no such problem. Haggai is also completely unaware of Cyrus's decree, which ordered the rebuilding of the temple, which was central to the plot of the book of Ezra. This serves as yet another reminder that, when it comes to the stories within the Bible and how those stories came to exist, it is always a complicated matter. The book begins with an editorial introduction appended to the first oracle. It informs us of the year of the oracle, which is the 2nd year under King Darius of Persia. At this time, an oracle of Yahweh came to Haggai, who was the prophet to Governor Zerubbabel and High Priest Joshua. We should point out here that these titles of governor and high priest weren't used in conjunction with these characters in the book of Ezra. The only person to be called high priest is Hilkiah in 2 Kings 22, but that is likely an anachronism. The term probably didn't exist until after worship had been consolidated in the Jerusalem temple sometime after the time of Joshua. This introduction also has some clumsy grammar, as it states that the oracle came through Haggai to Zerubbabel and Joshua, as if they are the recipients of the oracle, but the target audience is the populace, not its leaders. This grammar is preserved by several modern translations, such as the New American Bible and the NRSV. The first oracle begins with Yahweh instructing the people to reflect on their experience, as they have planted many crops but found their harvests lacking. They have eaten but still hunger, have worn clothing but haven't been warmed. This is to point to the hard toil with little reward during the restoration period, but also the futility of action without the grace of Yahweh. It's as much a theological argument as one of circumstance. The point he's trying to make here is that they look to constructing their own homes when they should be focused on building a house for Yahweh. Of course, we could point out that an incorporeal deity might wish his followers to be comfortable and safe before they build a house for a ghost, but the author doesn't see it that way. The point of the temple in the post-exilic period was to gather the people around a unifying symbol, so the author presents this building project as central to the community, more important even than the safety of the population. As they have built homes and brought in harvests, the bitter and jealous Yahweh has scattered their populace and blown down their homes like the big bad wolf. He withholds rain and prevents the earth from producing crops until he gets his way and has a new home constructed for him to dwell in. We can draw an analogy between this passage and the modern pastors who demand tithes from their congregations to maintain their lavish lifestyles. The idea that the people should live in squalor while the temple priests live in excess is an idea that predates the written record. Yahweh's response to their choice to construct their own homes is to afflict the people with curses that include drought, famine, and heat waves to punish every human, animal, and plant in the land of Judah. So rather than the people face outside opposition, as we saw in the book of Ezra, here in Haggai their enemy is the very God they chose to worship. The result of this oracle is that Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the people decide unanimously to follow and obey Yahweh and heed the words of this prophet. Yahweh then stirred the spirits of all the people and sent them to begin construction on his new home. So on the 21st of September, 520 BCE, they began construction on the new temple. Chapter 2 begins with an oracle assuring the people that their God is present, though in light of how the previous oracle ended, I'm not so sure his presence would be very reassuring. Haggai is once again told to speak to the governor, high priest, and all of the people. He asks who among them had seen the glory of his previous home and what they think of this new temple which has been constructed. This is a bit odd, as the opening lines give a date of merely 7 weeks after construction began, and they would likely still be clearing rubble from the ruins of the previous temple and working on the foundations of the new. He then encourages the people to be strong despite the fact that the new temple isn't as grand as the first temple. To reassure them, he explains that he will soon shake the heavens and the earth and bring riches from every land to fill the new temple with glory. So the temple is apparently finished in just 7 short weeks, and Yahweh will now plunder neighboring nations to furnish it. The plan is to create a temple more lavish than the former house of God, filled with silver and gold. Now you know where the prosperity gospel pastors get their theology. The next oracle begins in verse 10 as Yahweh's words came to Haggai once again, this time on the 18th of December. He instructs the prophet to ask the priest for a ruling. If someone carries sanctified meat in the folds of their priestly garments, and those garments happen to touch bread, wine, oils, or other food offerings, do those offerings somehow become sanctified? The priest responded that they do not. So then Haggai asked if a defiled person who has touched a corpse touches those food offerings, would those offerings become defiled? The priest responded that they indeed would become defiled. So the prophet declared that this would be the same with the people. They are corrupt, and so all of the works of their hands are corrupt, and what they offer in the temple is defiled. It's unclear who the subject of this oracle is. It could be the post-exilic community or some group within the city that is seen as outsiders, such as the Samaritans. Either way, there's something missing from the oracle that would shed light on its exact meaning. Another point of note is that this theology, the idea that the consecrated cannot transfer its purity through contact with its covering garments, will be reversed in the Gospels, as those authors draw upon the message in Matthew 9, when they have a sick woman touch the hem of Jesus' robe, and she is magically healed. In verse 20, we're told that the word of Yahweh came to Haggai a second time, which is a bit odd as this is the 5th oracle in the book. Details like this are called editorial fatigue. Editorial fatigue is when changes are made to a manuscript and the editors overlook contradictions that stem from those changes. So when there are a pair of oracles attributed to a prophet, but later editors add a collection of earlier oracles, they might overlook the fact that the number of oracles is mentioned somewhere in the text and forget to make the appropriate changes. This will happen again in the Jesus story, when he performs his first miracle, then many more miracles, and then performs his second miracle. Yahweh again declares that he will shake the heavens and the earth, and overthrow the thrones of kingdoms, and destroy the powers of nations. The deity himself will cause international destruction on behalf of the governor Zerubbabel, who has been chosen to represent Yahweh, who is the Lord of the heavenly army. Why exactly he has decided to go on a killing spree isn't stated and suggests that the oracle may be incomplete, or is in response to some other text which is now missing from the book. Speaking of books, we now move on to Malachi, a book which might have 3 or 4 chapters depending on which version of the Bible you're using. Not that your Bible is missing a chapter. It isn't. Chapters 3 and 4 are sometimes merged into a single chapter. Malachi means my messenger or my angel, and might not be a proper name at all. It also appears only here in the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, making its exact nature difficult to discern as we have no other context. It's also possible this is a shortened form of Malachi, the messenger of Yahweh. The book is primarily concerned with corruption within the temple following its rebuilding, and it is set in the early 5th century BCE, a few decades after the events of Haggai. The 3 or 4 chapters can be divided into 8 short sections, which are noted in many study Bibles. It begins with the section Israel preferred to Edom in the first 5 verses of chapter 1. An oracle of Yahweh comes to Malachi declaring the deity's love for the people of Israel, but not for those of Edom. It's phrased as choosing one brother over another, Jacob over Esau, as in the story of the 2 national progenitors of Genesis 25. Both nations have suffered devastation, but while Israel has been given a bright future and the hope of rebuilding, Yahweh promises to destroy anything that the Edomites might rebuild. Yahweh shall be angry with them forever in order to remind the people of the world outside of Israel that he is powerful. This brief oracle tells us a few things. First, it's there to give hope to a tormented people, the Israelites. This it has in common with all the prophetic works. Second, it promises that their neighbors will suffer, in this case, so that their misery might bring glory to Yahweh. Remember from the Exodus story that the entire point of the plagues of Egypt was to elevate Yahweh's reputation in the nation of Egypt. He deliberately prevented the Pharaoh from releasing the Hebrew slaves so that he could use the Egyptians as his own personal punching bag. Finally, it shows us that the idea of a merciful and just deity is anachronistic in the Old Testament. Yahweh will punish these people forever because they weren't his chosen people. Accusations of inadequate worship begins in verse 6 and ends with chapter 2, verse 9, and is focused on improper sacrifices in the temple and criticism of the temple priests. It begins by drawing a parallel between the relationship between father and son and Yahweh and his priests. This draws upon the commandments given in Exodus. The priest should honor Yahweh the same way a son honors his father. But that honor is now lacking. And his honor is equated with fear, as we see in verse 6. The food offerings made at the altar have been defiled. Blind and sickly animals are given as sacrifice, a direct violation of the law codes found in Leviticus 22 and Deuteronomy 15. The violations are so severe that Yahweh wishes one of the priests would just close the temple gates to prevent such offerings from being made. But alas, none among them has the courage to close down the corrupt temple. Yahweh, as he's reminded the people many times in the past, is the King of Israel, giving us another example of the concept of divine royalty. Remember that in the ancient world, kings were often thought of as earthly incarnations or representatives of their deities, and the kings of Israel and Judah were no exception. In the beginning of chapter 2, Yahweh issues his ultimatum. He shall give them a command, and if they fail to listen, then he'll send a curse upon them. Their offspring will be rebuked, and their curse shall be like dung on their faces. He then reveals that he has already inflicted this curse upon them because he already knew that they would not listen. He had given them reliable instruction and the promise of peace, but they perverted his words and walked with evil. This is a reference to the idea that some scriptures and practices in the temple are corrupt or apostate. This is a theological dispute within the temple cult that lies at the heart of much of the Second Temple writings. A curious point of note is the covenant of Levi is mentioned 3 times in this oracle, but we have no direct reference to it anywhere else in the Bible. It might lie behind Jeremiah 33:20 and Nehemiah 13:29, and it seems to be of some importance. But the establishment of this covenant and its nature are lost to time, likely due to later groups expunging it from their own scripture. The third section of Malachi is called Marriage and Divorce, and if you've been paying attention during the prophetic books, then you already know it's about the people of Judah breaking faith with Yahweh, and the whole thing is framed in terms of a marriage. This section spans verses 10 through 16 of chapter 2. The covenant between the land and Yahweh is the marriage covenant, and Judah has violated this covenant by cheating on Yahweh, which is to say, some of the people have turned to the worship of other gods, which the author of this book claims are foreign deities, though we know from past episodes that these were just the other gods in the ancient Hebrew pantheon before they became monotheistic. They observed foreign ceremonies at Yahweh's altar and worshipped a goddess. These are likely references to the worship of Asherah, a prominent Hebrew goddess worshipped in the Jerusalem temple for many centuries until religious reformers outlawed the practice. She was also Yahweh's mother, and later his wife, but that's a topic for another episode. The section ends with Yahweh declaring that he hates divorce and anyone who covers himself with a garment of violence should fear for his own life. This isn't a reference to actual divorce, which was acceptable under Jewish law, but the act of apostasy. And Yahweh deals harshly with those who turn from him to worship other gods. The fourth section is purification and just judgment, which is contained in the final verse of chapter 2. It states that the people have wearied Yahweh by ignoring evil and then wondering why Yahweh allows such wickedness to exist. This turns the age-old problem of the existence of evil on its head by blaming the people themselves for causing such evil. It also levies an accusation against any who would raise such a theological problem in the first place. The next section, the Messenger of the Covenant, is sometimes linked with the previous section as it reads like an answer to the question which was posed at the end of chapter 2. Yahweh sends a messenger to prepare the way for his coming. This could be read as a messianic figure or as an angel, though there might not be much of a difference. See the Enochic episodes for more information on the idea of a Messiah and an angel being a singular figure. Yahweh will suddenly appear in his temple, giving us a glimpse inside the Holy of Holies when it was thought that Yahweh would physically manifest inside of a giant box. He would then deliver a message concerning the covenant. This may seem odd, as it's first said that it would be an angel or a messenger who comes, but then it's Yahweh who appears to deliver the message. Though we must remember that originally Yahweh was thought of as an intermediary between Elyon and the human race. So this might have originally been a passage about Elyon sending Yahweh as his angelic emissary. See Margaret Barker's book, The Great Angel, A Study of Israel's Second God, for more detail about the idea of Yahweh as an angel. This angelic figure, whoever it may be, will come like a refining fire, melting people down to remove their impurities. This too has been seen before in the prophetic books such as Isaiah 125 and in Zechariah 13:9, which we'll cover in the next episode. This will also be merged with the third cave concept from Enoch's visions to become the realm of purgatory in later generations. This refining fire makes pure again the populations of Israel and Judah, so they may once again be accepted by their God, though he will also destroy the wicked, including adulterers, perjurers, those who cheat workers out of their wages, oppress widows and orphans, abuse resident aliens, and sorcerers, which is just a description of Jeff Bezos. The sixth section, Gifts for Yahweh and Blessings for the People, begins with Yahweh claiming that he never changes, and part of that consistency is his maintaining the people of Israel forever. Beginning in their ancestors' generation, the people of Israel have disregarded Yahweh's statutes. Now, he commands them to return to proper worship, so that he may return to the people. This shows that Yahweh's mercy and love is contingent on reformed styles of religious practice, and their lack of pure food offerings now results in a lack of food on their own tables. If they wish to end the drought and famine, they must first present their God with acceptable sacrifices. This harkens back to the ancient pagan practices all around the world of buying favor with a weather or fertility deity to ensure a bountiful harvest. The seventh section, the need to serve Yahweh, begins in chapter 3, verse 13, and ends with chapter 3, verse 21, or chapter 4, verse 3 if your Bible splits the final chapter into 2 chapters. Yahweh grows upset with the people who see no reason to worship him, as such worship brings no reward. This too has been seen before, especially in episode 79. Such evildoers not only test Yahweh, but prosper and manage to escape punishment. This attitude will eventually lead to the belief of a just afterlife, in order to reconcile the problem of evil in the world and the belief in a just and righteous deity. The people want wickedness to be punished, so they will eventually invent the belief that those people are indeed punished. We see a stepping stone on this path to belief in verse 16, as they mention a book which records the deeds of men being kept by Yahweh. This will serve as a ledger containing all of the good and evil deeds of a man by which he will be judged after his death. The Son of Man figure will later be the keeper of this book. See episodes 50 and 51 for more information on that topic. The promise of a future judgment is now linked with the day of the Lord, as Yahweh is said to come upon them like a blazing fire to judge the righteous and the wicked, burning away evil forever. A curious passage is found in verse 20, as it is said that those who fear his name will see the Sun of Justice rising with healing in her wings. This passage, which mentions a winged solar disk associated with justice, is almost certainly a reference to the goddess Asherah, who is often associated with solar imagery. And it should also be noted that interpreters like to imagine that the word her is ambiguous, but it isn't. It's a feminine pronoun which is used, though that hasn't stopped them from replacing the word with its wings or even his wings. The reference here in verse 20 is that of a healing goddess depicted as a winged sun. The final section deals with Moses and Elijah, giving us one of the few references to Moses outside of the Torah. Remember that the late dating of the Torah material precluded the references of prominent figures such as Moses from most books of the Hebrew Bible. Most scholars also believe that this section is a later addition to the text, meaning that in its original form, the book of Malachi, with all its mention of covenant law, still showed no indication that the author had ever heard of Moses or the Exodus story. The reader is called to remember the law of Moses, whom was charged on Mount Horeb to deliver the statutes of Yahweh to the people of Israel, and later the prophet Elijah. The people should observe the commandment to honor their father, in this case Yahweh, lest he come to the land and destroy it. There are similarities in the phrasing here at the end of the book with the messenger of the covenant section at the beginning of chapter 3, which may indicate that the editor who added this epilogue was indicating that Elijah would be the bringer of the covenant, a belief made possible by the story of Elijah being taken up into heaven instead of dying. This makes Elijah a parallel to Enoch, who was likewise taken into the heavens to escape death and would serve as a deliverer of a covenant to reform a people in preparation for the day of the Lord. This belief in a messianic figure who serves as a mediator between heaven and earth and a deliverer of a sacred covenant before earthly judgment will later serve as a foundation for the Jesus story. And that, dear listener, brings the book of Malachi and this episode to a close. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.